Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into a really specific piece of the patent puzzle, the MPEP, the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure.
That's right. And we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're zooming in on Chapter 2100, patentability, and even more specifically, Section 2172.
Section 2172. Okay, what's the focus there?
It's all about making sure the claims, the part that defines the invention legally actually line up with what the inventor thinks their invention is. It sounds simple, but it gets tricky.
Right, the claims have to match what the inventor regards as the invention. So how does the Patent Office, the USPTO, handle that? What's their starting point?
Well, they start with a presumption, a pretty strong one, actually, based on, precedent. Cases like in remor and in raison, they assume the claims you file are what you regard as the invention.
Okay, so they take your word for it initially. The claims say X, so they assume you think X is the invention.
Exactly. That's the default. They won't second guess it unless there's compelling evidence suggesting otherwise.
Compelling evidence. What does that look like? Does it come from the patent description itself?
Usually not, interestingly enough. For this specific issue, under 112B, just finding a disagreement between the specification, the description part, and the claims isn't generally enough on its own.
Huh. Okay, so where does this compelling evidence come from then?
It typically has to be something outside the main application documents. Think statements made in a response to the examiner, or maybe in a brief file during prosecution, or even an affidavit.
Ah, okay. So if you're arguing with the examiner, maybe you say something like, well, the real breakthrough here is feature Y, but feature Y isn't actually in your claims.
Precisely. That's a classic example. If you make admissions or arguments suggesting the core inventive concept is different from what's claimed, the examiner might say, hold on, your claims don't seem to cover what you are telling me is the invention.
Gotcha. Cases like Solomon or in Cormany kind of illustrate that, right?
Yeah.
Where external remarks can cause trouble for the claims.
Exactly. Another situation mentioned is if the specification itself is really emphatic, like it insists a certain element is absolutely critical, indispensable even.
Like it says, this device only works if you include this special coding.
Right. If the description hammers home that this coding is non-optional, absolutely essential, but then your claims don't mention the coding at all.
Then the examiner might push back, saying the claims don't cover the actual invention you described as essential. Like in that ex parte meta case, maybe.
That's the idea. It flags a potential disconnect. The claims need to encompass what you've defined as necessary.
Okay, that makes sense. You need consistency.
Uh-huh.
But what if the inventor's understanding changes during the process? They start thinking the invention is A, B, C, but later realize D is also important, or maybe C isn't needed.
Good question. And the MPP section addresses this, citing cases like in Saunders. Inventors aren't, locked into their very first thought forever.
So they can change their mind.
They can. They can refine their understanding, amend claims, add new ones.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a big caveat. Any new or changed claim must still be fully supported by the original disclosure. Whatever you filed initially has to provide the basis for those later claims.
Right, you can't add completely new concepts later and pretend they were there all along. But if the original description mentioned A, B, C, and D, you could later write claims focusing just on D, even if your first claims were only A plus B.
Exactly. As long as D was described in the original filing, you can claim it later and still potentially get the benefit of that original filing date under 35 U.S.C. 120. It's about evolving the focus, not adding brand new stuff.
Okay, that distinction is important. Now, the sources also mention Section 2172.01 about unclaimed essential subject matter. How's that different?
It's related but slightly different angle.
Yeah.
Here, the examiner is looking specifically at the specification, the description, and asking, does this description say feature X is necessary or essential to practice the invention?
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, is feature X actually included in the claims? If something is described as essential but left out of the claims, that's a potential problem.
So less about external statements and more about an internal contradiction between the description saying you need X and the claims not mentioning X.
Pretty much. It could lead to different kinds of rejections, maybe under enablement or written description in 112A, or potentially this 112B issue we're talking about, that the claims don't cover what the inventor regards as the invention because they omit something stated as essential.
But how do you draw the line? What if the description just says feature X is preferred, or gives it as one example?
That's the key distinction. Merely being preferred or illustrative usually isn't enough to make it essential. The language has to be stronger, indicating it's indispensable.
Like that in Riyaf case suggests, where broad language can counter the idea that something specific is critical.
Right. If the disclosure provides alternatives or talks about the feature more broadly, it's harder to argue it's truly essential and must be in every claim. It depends heavily on the specific wording used in the specification.
So the words you choose in your description really matter for defining what's considered essential later on.
Absolutely. It all circles back to ensuring alignment between the claims, the detailed description, and any other statements you make about what your invention truly is.
Wow. Okay, so we started with the basic idea that claims define the invention, but then saw how that can be challenged either by things you say outside the claims or by leaving something out of the claims that your own description calls essential.
And also that key point that you can refine your view as long as the original blueprint, the specification, supports it.
It really highlights how carefully you need to think about not just the claims, but the entire story you tell about your invention.
Definitely. And thinking about how this all plays out, how these rules force alignment, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How should this detailed focus on aligning claims, description, and inventor statements actually influence the way you, as an inventor or practitioner, approach documenting and even just talking about an invention right from the very start?
That's a great point to ponder. Before we wrap up, we absolutely want to take a moment to thank Mike Shepard, the creative director of this project. His dedication has been instrumental in bringing this content to life.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And also, just a necessary heads up for everyone listening. This deep dive summary, including the parts about the MPEP, was generated using AI tools. It might contain errors or miss some nuances.
Right. It's meant for general educational and informational purposes. It's definitely not legal advice, and it's no substitute for consulting the official MPEP, talking to a qualified instructor, or getting advice from a registered patent practitioner.
Please rely on those official sources for any authoritative guidance.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into making sure your claims reflect what you really invented, according to MPEP 2172. We hope it gave you some valuable insights to chew on.